concrete opportunity to look at privacy. David Munch raised the issue about information that people might have or might not want to disclose. So in terms of medical information, he addressed the issue of stigma, but our issue is going to be broader, and but the stigma issue plays a major role, particularly in mental health and in some regards substance abuse. So I want to thank you for joining us for this panel regarding the privacy of psychiatric data, which should include substance abuse data, so we want to stress that. The tragedy of Newtown brought to the forefront the debate of the importance of early identification and treatment of those with serious mental illness. At the same time, privacy of those treatment records must be considered, both to protect the patient and to ensure the trusting relationship between the patient and the doctor or counselor. So we realize we need to create an effective balance between patient privacy and public safety that protects the American people in addition to protecting the patient. We need to do so without throwing up barriers to much-needed treatment for those suffering from mental illness. So we're fortunate today to have a panel of experts with a broad range of experiences and knowledge in the areas of privacy and treatment, and they're going to share that expertise with us regarding these complex issues. And I'd like to stress that not only does this have implications for psychiatric records, but any sensitive information that jurisdictions that people would want to consider. And after their presentation, we'll have time to ask questions from the audience. So I'd like to introduce Patricia Raymer, who is the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services Commissioner for the state of Connecticut. Now, she has more than 25 years of experience with public and private behavioral health agencies, and before being appointed commissioner, she served as the Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Mental Health and Addiction. During her tenure as Commissioner and as a Deputy Commissioner, Ms. Raymer has worked in partnership with individuals in recovery, families, advocacy groups, and service providers to ensure that individuals have a meaningful life in the community. And through her efforts, the department collaborated with the Department of Children and Families to establish a youth services program for children transitioning from the children's mental health system to the adult system. Not only is she from Connecticut, but she also brings news of a recent development in the law about privacy and mental health information in Connecticut. So, Ms. Raymer.
I'm going to speak very briefly about the 1214, the events of 1214 and the aftermath and the impact on the system. And I want to immediately say that one of the changes, interestingly enough, in the law spoke to developing a registry for individuals who are admitted voluntarily for psychiatric admissions. And one of the questions that came up from the advocates, and I thought this was very interesting, they didn't want to throw people with substance abuse hospitalizations or treatment under the bus, but they wanted to know why they weren't included, and they're not. And I can tell you that the answer that we got for that when we spoke to the states was they all had family members. They didn't want them registered, which we found very interesting. Again, we were not in favor of individuals with substance abuse or seeking substance abuse treatment being a part of this. We didn't even ask the question, but the advocates did, and I thought it was very interesting the responses we got. So very, very briefly, I'm going to talk about our role in Newtown and some of the challenges that we faced as it came to trying to protect Adam Lanza and his family's privacy. And one of the things that is a somewhat controversial statement, I think, but I'm going to make it anyway, is that there's a lot of discussion about the 26 deaths. In fact, there were 28 deaths. Adam shot his mother and shot himself. And so we all know that in these instances, what he really did was commit suicide. But because of the atrocity and the death of 20 children, and we're all wired differently to respond to the deaths of young children, there has been no discussion, or very little discussion, except among mental health providers and advocates about the fact that this was in fact an act of suicide. We do not know a lot about him. What is public, and I'm only going to share what is public, is that he does appear that his parents were divorced, and his mother was receiving a large amount of child support or alimony, I'm not sure. And as part of her divorce papers, there was a large amount of money in the neighborhood of $250,000 that was supposed to be utilized for treatment for Adam. We don't know for what. We don't know what diagnosis he had. The information that was published in the papers, is there anybody that's a journalist in the room? Thank you. Everything that was published in the first 2 weeks following the event was wrong. I was there for the first 2 weeks every single day. We deployed 200 staff members to help meet the behavioral health needs and the psychological first aid needed by the schools, by the families. We did all the death notifications to the family members in concert with the state police officer and the clergy officer. And we maintained contact with those families to this point. We stayed in the school system for 3 months. We stayed in the community for 3 months. And I will tell you that there has been one more serious event in that community that occurred probably about a month ago, suicide of a 12-year-old boy, which shook the community once again. Now I don't believe that suicide was related to this event. However, he's 12 years old, which was devastating to the school system that had already been put through some really devastating events. My biggest challenge, I was tasked by the governor with managing all the behavioral health for the town of Newtown and the state. My biggest challenge was the amount of individuals that flooded in wanting to help, including Dr. Phil, and the ability to help people to understand that was not a good idea. And unfortunately, people in these sorts of tragic events, family members choose to do what they want to do, and I'm not going to criticize anybody for that, but there was a lot of media attention and a lot of people being interviewed when I think they were in the early stages of grief, and obviously we had concerns about that. But again, so obviously lots of legislative interest, lots of issues around changing the laws in Connecticut, and the big fight was this access to guns, because as you know, there were guns in his home, lots and lots of guns. And we do know that his mother, and again, this is all public record, his mother bought him guns and often took him to shooting ranges. And so he used the guns that were in his home to go to the elementary school where he had been a student and to get in and shoot these individuals. So the big debate was, well, is it guns or is it mental health? And we don't have an adequate mental health system, and we don't have early intervention and prevention. One of the issues for us as the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services is our mission is to serve individuals who are either have severe mental illness or pretty chronic substance abuse issues. These are usually individuals who are uninsured, or as we say, underinsured. We do not deal with a lot of individuals who are privately insured or who can pay for care. Now, one of the things that we do know is that because of, and I don't use the word stigma, I use the word discrimination. I really feel people with mental health diagnoses and substance abuse diagnoses are the last bastion of discrimination, although a lot of people argue with me about that. I think language is important, and I think discrimination is a much more powerful word, and so I've moved to using that before this event. But it was clear that everybody wanted to blame the mental health system and the lack of services. This young man would have never come to the attention of our department. He was wealthy. Newtown is a very, very wealthy, very tight-knit community. And again, it appears that his mother had been tasked with getting him services, we don't know what kind of services, and paying privately. And one of the things we know is that many people do choose to pay privately, even if they have good insurance, because they don't want a diagnosis on their medical record. And we know that, I know people that do that. So that's, again, the issue of seeking treatment and discrimination. However, in what we had an e-cert bill that was passed before the session, actually, well, right at the beginning of the session. That bill addressed 3 areas: gun laws, mental health, and school safety. So Connecticut passed the most, I think, the tightest gun laws in the country at this point, in many different ways. We said that certain types of guns, I don't know a lot about guns, but high-level, high-magazine guns, certain guns that are more used for example, for service or by the police, are no longer going to be available for sale. I can tell you that as this law was being passed, the House and the Senate the Capitol building was flooded, and we almost couldn't pass through the halls with people that were opposed to this. The governor was supposed to speak at an event in the Capitol, and people decided it was not safe for him to go to that event. The hearings on the gun laws, I've never seen anything like them. I watched them, and it was really very frightening. People who have guns and believe in the Second Amendment want their guns. What they said over and over again was this was the mental health system's fault. And so there are several commissions that the governor put together and the legislature put together having to do with gun laws, mental health, and school safety. Part of the e-cert bill that has to do with privacy, which I think is what we're here to talk about today, was that anybody admitted to a psychiatric hospital on a voluntary basis, meaning they go and sign a voluntary form and say, I'm seeking admission. They are not on, in our state we have what we call a 15-day emergency certificate that a psychiatrist can write, or actually any physician can write, that states that the person is a danger to themselves or others, and then they have no choice. They have to go into the hospital. They have the right to a 72-hour probable cause hearing, which is in front of a probate judge. And then as soon as they no longer meet the criteria for the paper, they're supposed to be discharged. I can tell you that doesn't happen as often as it should. However, they didn't include that in this bill. They only included people who are voluntarily admitted. Now, we knew this, I knew this, and we chose not to bring it to their attention because we were trying to figure out, our biggest concern was, once this is in legislation and people know they're going to go on a registry for 6 months after hospitalization, which means they cannot purchase a gun, and they're going to be on a registry, that they will not seek treatment. We were very concerned about that.
Public information registry.
The registry will be held by the department. We do not have this worked out at all. There are so many legal loopholes. What we are beginning to work on is the change of voluntary forms for hospitals so that there is a statement on there that says, so the individual understands that they will go on to this registry. The registry will be available so that the police, when the gun shop calls to say is the person on this registry, the probate court or the police, we're not sure yet who, will be able to say yes or no, they're not in the registry. And then we have to scrub the registry every 6 months. The advocates are very, very concerned about that. The timing of this was very tight. We were supposed to implement July 1st. The session ended last night at midnight. We were able to change some of the dates so that we have until October 1st to get this all in place. I don't believe we'll be able to meet that deadline either. And I can share with you that the governor was opposed to this. He understands that this is going to decrease people's willingness to seek treatment, and that we hope that we'll be able to get it changed. But it was clearly a negotiation point. We don't, we want gun laws to be different, then you change your mental health laws. We already participate and have for years in the NICS system. That has been in place for us for years. We have a black box. Information goes into the black box, and it's available through the probate judge system, and they are able to, if somebody goes in to buy a gun, and they have been probated to the hospital, they cannot buy a gun. And I think it's for a period, it's a long period.
It's lifetime unless you have a relief of disabilities in your state.
Right. So that's been in place, and we've participated in that, not necessarily willingly, but we have. The FBI often comes in and pushes us to give them more information. We've stood our ground on that, and we won't. But this obviously brings a new and different twist to this. So we don't have all the details worked out. We're working on it actively right now. There are legal loopholes that you could drive a truck through. And I am very invested in trying to change this. But we know we won't be able to until probably the next session. So I'm going to stop there. And
Did the governor sign it?
the governor, yes, the governor did sign it. We had discussion about him vetoing it, and the gun issue was so critical to him that he didn't want to veto the bill.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. I need to remind people that I'm Wesley Clark, the Director of the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment at the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, and the Commissioner is one of our recipients of federal block grant funds. So, but that's independent of this issue.
Good.
And I think we contacted you with regard to Newtown rather than marching in. So just want to make it clear that we've worked in concert with you, let you make the decision.
Lots of support.
Well, very good. Next, I'd like to introduce Denalza Bayer, who is the Policy Counsel in the American Civil Liberties Union's Washington Legislative Office. And she focuses on disability rights, racial justice issues, human rights, and housing policy. And prior to her work with the ACLU, she served as counsel to the U.S. House Judiciary Committee for Representative John Conyers, who's the ranking member and previous chairman of the Judiciary Committee. She's also worked on justice policy research for the Urban Institute. Ms. Bayer.
Thank you. Thank you. And this is very interesting to hear about what's going on in Connecticut, because right now we're kind of in a tipping point in the states. Congress considered legislation of various forms, but the gun lobby was largely successful in blocking back any attempts to actually regulate guns, and the issues that they ended up concentrating on were school safety and mental health issues. That seemed to be what brought everyone together on a bipartisan basis. What we're concerned about, and I guess discrimination is a good word, we're concerned about the rhetoric of all the conversations about gun violence after Newtown, and about the consequences of some of these new laws. I think that we were all horrified by what happened in Newtown. I mean, I think everyone stopped, what they were doing when they heard what happened, and were, shocked by the tragedy, because especially the loss of lives of young children. And I think everyone wanted to look for answers about what we could do to prevent future tragedies. I think when we have some distance, I think we all agree and support expanding access to treatment for everyone, regardless of their ability to pay. And that's been an issue, particularly for years. There have been declining funding to community behavioral health services, and the recession really made those problems even worse because the federal government wasn't able to give as much money to the states, and they have to balance their budgets every year, and it put everyone in a bind. But the situation of Adam Lanza, as you said, he would not have been someone who came to the attention necessarily of any law enforcement authority prior to this attack. In fact, people who commit these kinds of mass violence acts they're like lightning in a bottle. It's almost impossible to predict. I mean, there might be a triggering event, maybe a divorce, maybe they come back from war and there's PTSD, maybe there's some sort of domestic violence situation, or they lose their job at work. These are the kind of triggering events. But these mass shootings are a very small proportion of overall gun violence. They're about 1%, a little less than 1%. Most acts of gun violence are committed by one individual shooting another individual who they know, usually in some sort of intimate way, like a family member, a romantic partner, mother, father, brother, sister, or a coworker. So for the ACLU's perspective, what our concern is that if we're trying to come up with smart policy that balances the needs of the public with the needs of the individual for privacy and having their full access to civil liberties, we shouldn't tailor policy to address what are relatively rare events, what are horrific, tragic events that we all agree, we'd like to prevent, but which are not only a tiny proportion of gun violence, they're a tiny proportion of violence as a whole. And I think after Newtown, the tendency was, and this is always, there's kind of a tendency to do this anytime there's a mass shooting, is to look at mental health issues, look at people with mental disabilities, and look at how we can change what restrictions they're subject to. Now, the consequences of this are that stigma is furthered when people with mental disabilities are associated with violence, and incorrectly associated with violence, actually. The data shows that less than 4% of violent acts every year can be attributed to people with mental disabilities, and that includes acts involving guns, and as well as those not involving guns. So not only is it not a good fit in terms of who is responsible for most acts of violence, but it connects people with mental disabilities with the image of violent acts. And the danger of that is, one, we're talking about a huge minority population within the United States, because the statistics are that every year, about 1 out of every 5 adults in the United States will have a mental disability of some sort. And over the course of everyone's lifetime, about 1 out of every 2 people will have the conditions of a psychiatric disability at some point during their life. And my personal belief is that those numbers are conservative estimates, just based on people I know in my own personal life, professional life. I think those are even conservative estimates. So we're talking about millions of Americans every year who have mental disabilities. And so we have to be very careful about the consequences of new laws, as well as the way that we discuss these issues. Although Congress had a stalemate on the mental health issues, well, it is interesting. So the Senate took the issues up, both the Senate and the House, but only the Senate brought legislation to the floor. The only thing that ended up passing was a bill that really dealt with treatment, and it was kind of an omnibus mental health package. That was what they could agree on, and as an amendment to the gun bill, although the ultimate gun bill did not pass. And so Congress had a stalemate. So nothing really happened. It's not really happening at the federal level, although there's rulemaking right now looking at the NICS system and HIPAA. But the states have been doing a lot. And I think that's where we really have to be watching what's going on and what the consequences are, which is why it's so interesting to hear what's going on in Connecticut. Because after Newtown, I think that really did spur a lot of action in the state houses, and particularly with regard to individuals who voluntarily seek inpatient treatment. So we heard about Connecticut's law. Maryland also changed their laws so that if an individual voluntarily seeks inpatient hospitalization for 30 or more days, they are banned from having a firearm unless they submit, they apply for relief from disabilities, they're willing to open up their medical records, have their doctor attest they're not a danger to themselves or others. And I think there are a lot of consequences, unforeseen consequences, that are resulting from these new state laws. And I think we don't even fully know the landscape of the state laws. There are some states like Texas, which previously had restricted the firearms rights of people who had voluntarily received inpatient treatment or had certain diagnoses. And the ACLU, we're not just concerned about the Second Amendment rights are one issue, but it's a broader issue than just the right to own a gun, because once you are in a database that regulates you, that can have both criminal justice context in terms of if you're ever arrested, if you're ever arrested in possession of a gun, it can affect your employment possibilities. For instance, if you are a law enforcement officer and you live in my home state of Maryland, you would not seek inpatient treatment, because you would then not be able to own a gun, and then you wouldn't be able to do your job. Or if you wanted to be in the military. I mean, there's a lot of consequences in the employment context, and the states are also looking at this as an area of regulation. Massachusetts has a law that has been introduced, it hasn't yet been passed, but it's a gun control bill, and it includes a provision that allows licensing authorities in the state of Massachusetts to get access to an individual's mental health records before an occupational license can be given. So I think we're still right now getting the landscape of what's going on in every state house in terms of what regulation is being proposed, but the concern is that if people are going to have all these negative consequences attached, if both they feel like people are going to associate them with violence, if they are identified as someone with a mental disability, and if there's a possibility with that now or in the future, their medical records will be accessible by a future employer, or if they want to, obtain, occupational licenses apply to everyone from lawyers to barbers to taxi drivers. They affect a huge number of people in various fields. And so the concern is that you will have people deterred from seeking treatment. You're going to place greater restrictions on the ability of people with mental disabilities who are currently receiving treatment to be able to do perform certain jobs, have access to certain benefits. And the database issue is a huge concern because whenever you create a database of any sort, even if it's only created for a single purpose, and there's not an intention to link it up with another database in the future, that can happen. In the voting context, there was a database created by the federal government for people who were not citizens but had access, qualified for certain federal benefits. That database was then used in the future to cross-check against voter rolls to then investigate people who were suspected of not being legally able to vote in the state. So, today it's kind of fitting. There was the big news story about the NSA getting the phone records of millions of Americans, and this is an area where if you build a database, they will come. We're in an area of increasing computerization, and the database security issues are huge, particularly if we don't have really stringent, strict guidelines about how data is used, when it's purged, what individuals have access to data on people with mental disabilities, when they can access that data, what happens if a state or federal government makes an inquiry and wants to link it to another database. I mean, this is kind of uncharted territory, particularly because with the NICS system, we, just last year, the NICS system,
I don't know what the NICS system is.
National Instant Criminal Background Check System.
Okay, thanks.
I'll miss that.
That's okay.
Sorry.
That-
yeah, the NICS system